She agreed to be his girlfriend for a business deal. Nothing real. No emotions. Just a contract that would benefit them both. He needed a perfect partner for his image, and she needed the money. It was simple, at least that's what she thought. For weeks, she played her role. Public appearances, holding hands, standing by his side. She followed every rule, spoke only when necessary, and never questioned the arrangement. She reminded herself that it was temporary. That once the deal was done, they would go their separate ways like strangers. But everything changed the night she overheard him talking on the phone. "She's just a game to me." A pause. "Once this is over, I won't even remember her name." Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress.
Her heart should not have reacted.
She should not have cared. After all, wasn't it their agreement? No feelings. No attachments. But something in her shifted. He thought she was just a game. That she was disposable. That she was nothing.
Fine.
If that's how he wanted to play, she would show him what a real game looked like. At first, it was just about revenge. Making him regret underestimating her. Turning the tables, so he would be the one to suffer. But the deeper she went, the more dangerous it became. The more twisted their relationship became. Because somewhere along the way, the lines blurred. Hatred. Desire. Revenge. Obsession. Neither of them could back down. And neither of them wanted to. The next morning, she acted as if nothing had changed. She smiled at him like always, held his hand when the cameras were on, and played her role to perfection. But inside, her mind was already working. If he thought she was a game, she would show him how to play. She started small. A missed call when he expected her to answer. A sudden change in plans that left him waiting. A cold, distant look when they were alone, only to turn soft and affectionate when others were watching. He noticed. "Is something wrong?" he asked one evening, his sharp eyes studying her. She tilted her head, giving him a practiced smile. "Of course not. Why do you ask?" He didn't believe her. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his fingers curled slightly, as if resisting the urge to reach for her.
Good.
Let him wonder. Let him feel the confusion, the frustration. But that was only the beginning. She began getting closer to people he didn't like. Laughing a little too much in front of his business rivals. Pretending to be interested in a man he despised. Never enough to break the contract, but just enough to get under his skin. And it worked. One night, after a public event, he grabbed her wrist the moment they were alone. His grip was firm, but not rough. His eyes burned into hers, a storm of emotions swirling beneath his usual cold exterior. "What are you doing?" She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Nothing. Just playing the role you gave me." A muscle in his jaw ticked. "Don't test me." She leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper.
"Why?"
"Afraid you might lose?" For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them crackled with something dangerous. Something neither of them wanted to name. This was supposed to be revenge. She was supposed to make him suffer. But then, why did it feel like she was the one getting pulled in? Why did it feel like she wasn't just playing the game anymore? She was part of it. His grip on her wrist tightened slightly, just enough to remind her that he wasn't someone to be played with. "You think this is a game?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it. She met his gaze without flinching. "Isn't it?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "You're pushing me." She tilted her head slightly, a mocking glint in her eyes. "And you don't like that, do you?" He exhaled sharply, his fingers loosening but not letting go. "Whatever you're trying to do, stop. You agreed to this arrangement. Don't forget your place." Her smile didn't waver. "Oh, I haven't forgotten. But you did." He frowned. "What?" She stepped closer, their bodies almost touching. He didn't move away. She lowered her voice, making sure he felt every word. "You forgot that I'm not just some pawn in your little business deal. You played me first. Now it's my turn." His jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." She raised an eyebrow. "Then show me." A tense silence stretched between them. The air felt charged, thick with something unspoken. He was used to being in control, to having the upper hand. But for the first time, he wasn't sure who was winning. Finally, he let go of her wrist, but his fingers trailed along her skin before pulling away. "Be careful," he murmured, "because if you start this game, I won't let you win." She held his gaze, her smile unwavering. "We'll see about that." And just like that, the game had truly begun. He watched her, eyes dark and calculating, searching for a crack in her confidence. She didn't flinch, didn't waver. She had made her move, and now she was waiting for his. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was loaded, charged with unspoken words, with something deeper than anger, deeper than revenge. Finally, he exhaled a slow, measured breath. "You think you're clever, don't you?" His voice was soft, almost amused, but there was something dangerous lurking beneath it. She lifted a shoulder in a lazy shrug. "I don't think. I know." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're playing with fire." She stepped closer, just enough to invade his space. Just enough to remind him that she wasn't afraid. "Good. I like the heat." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable, something raw. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the cold, controlled man she had agreed to pretend for. "Careful," he murmured. "If you push too hard, you might not like what happens next." She tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. "And if I do?" His hand moved before she could react, fingers wrapping around the back of her neck. Not hard, not rough, but firm enough to make her heart slam against her ribs. "Then you better be ready for the consequences." Her breath hitched, but she refused to let him see it. Instead, she smirked. "Are you trying to scare me?" He leaned in, just a fraction, just enough for his breath to ghost over her skin. "No," he said, voice impossibly low. "I'm warning you." She held his gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to break first. "And what if I don't listen?" His fingers twitched against her skin, as if restraining himself, as if considering his next move. "Then don't say I didn't warn you." The moment stretched, too long, too dangerous. It was a game, but it didn't feel like one anymore. The stakes had changed. The lines had blurred. And for the first time, she wondered if she had underestimated him. But she wouldn't back down.
Not now.
Not ever. She slowly lifted her hand, tracing a single finger down the front of his suit, her touch barely there. His jaw tightened, his breath hitching for just a second. "Your move, then," she whispered. And with that, she pulled away, turning on her heel and walking out of the room without looking back. But she didn't need to. She knew he was watching. She knew this wasn't over. Not even close. She walked out of the room without a glance back, but she could feel it, the weight of his gaze burning into her back. He was watching, measuring, calculating. Good. Let him think. Let him wonder. Let him start questioning just how much control he really had. By the time she reached the car waiting outside, her heartbeat had steadied, her mask perfectly in place. She slid into the seat, her posture relaxed, as if she hadn't just thrown down a challenge to a man who thrived on power. The driver shut the door behind her, and just as the engine hummed to life, her phone vibrated. A message. Him. "You shouldn't have walked away." A slow smile tugged at her lips. She took her time typing her reply.
Her. Why?
"Afraid you're losing control?" She watched the 3 dots appear, then disappear. And then, him. "You'll find out soon enough." A warning. A promise. She should have been cautious. Should have stopped while she still had the upper hand. But that wasn't an option anymore. Not when this game had just started. The next evening, she arrived at the gala, perfectly poised, dressed in a sleek, floor-length gown that hugged her figure just enough to make an impression. She had played this role for weeks, his stunning, composed girlfriend, always at his side, always speaking when spoken to, never crossing the invisible line of their arrangement. Tonight, she was rewriting the rules. As she stepped inside the grand hall, the chandeliers casting a golden glow over the sea of elite guests, she spotted him instantly. He was standing near the bar, dressed in sharp black, talking to an investor. But his body was tense. His gaze was already on her. She smiled. Not at him, but at the man approaching her. A billionaire heir, known for his charm and reputation. "You look breathtaking tonight," the heir said smoothly, offering his hand. She took it, letting her fingers linger just a second too long. "Do I?" The tension across the room thickened. She didn't need to look to know he was watching. Didn't need to turn to feel the shift in the air. She laughed at something the heir said, tilting her head just slightly, just enough to expose her neck, just enough to play the part of a woman completely at ease. A shadow moved behind her. "That's enough." A familiar voice.
Low.
Commanding. Before she could react, a firm hand wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a hard, unyielding chest. Her breath caught, but she didn't let it show. "Excuse us," he said, his tone polite but edged with something darker. The heir hesitated, glancing between them, before giving her a slight nod and walking away. She turned her head slightly, her voice smooth. "Jealous?" His fingers tightened against her waist for the briefest second before he let go. "Careful," he murmured, his lips just inches from her ear. "You don't want to start a war you can't win." She turned fully, facing him, meeting his gaze head-on. "Who says I want to win?" Something flashed in his eyes, something unreadable. Then he smirked. "Then let's play." And just like that, the rules shattered. This was no longer just business. This was war. And neither of them were backing down. The music swelled around them, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filling the grand hall. But in that moment, nothing existed except him and her. The game they had started, the war neither of them was willing to lose. She took a slow step back, deliberately putting space between them, but his gaze never wavered. He was watching her, reading her, waiting to see what she would do next. She smoothed her hands down the fabric of her gown, her expression cool, composed. "If you're going to keep dragging me away from conversations, people might start asking questions." He didn't blink. "Let them." Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's not part of the deal." He stepped closer, his presence a quiet, undeniable force. "The deal changed the moment you decided to play games with me." "I thought you liked games." "I do." His voice was lower now, edged with something dangerous. "But you won't like the way I play." She arched a brow, unfazed. "Then show me." His smirk deepened, but before he could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Am I interrupting something?" She turned her head slightly, her expression shifting instantly into polite interest. The CEO of one of his biggest rival companies stood nearby, glass in hand, amusement dancing in his eyes.
Perfect.
She had spent the last few days learning exactly which people would irritate him the most. This man was at the top of the list. She smiled. "Not at all. We were just discussing something personal." The CEO's gaze flickered between them, curiosity evident. "Personal? That's rare for him." He extended his hand to her. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Before she could respond, before she could even reach for the handshake, he stepped in. His hand landed firmly at the small of her back, his grip just a little too possessive. "She's not interested." His tone was polite, but the warning underneath it was clear. The CEO chuckled. "Didn't realize you spoke for her." She glanced up at him, her voice smooth. "He doesn't." His fingers pressed slightly against her back, a silent challenge. She ignored it. "Then I suppose I'll have to steal a dance later," the CEO said with a grin, before excusing himself. The moment he was gone, she turned to him. "That was rude." "That was necessary." She let out a soft hum, tilting her head. "You're acting like a jealous boyfriend." He didn't flinch. "I'm acting like a man who doesn't like losing." "Then you should have been more careful before treating me like a game." His jaw tightened. "And what do you think you're doing now?" She smiled sweetly. "Winning." Something in his expression darkened. His fingers brushed against her lower back again, a silent, dangerous promise. "You haven't won yet. Then you better try harder." The moment stretched. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. And just when she thought he would back down, he suddenly leaned in, his lips brushing just past her ear. Be careful what you ask for. A slow, shivering thrill ran down her spine, but she didn't let it show. She refused to be the first to break. So instead, she turned her head, so close their lips were almost touching, and whispered, "Make me." His eyes darkened. And just like that, the game became something else entirely. His breath hitched for just a fraction of a second, so brief, so subtle that anyone else wouldn't have noticed. But she did. For the first time, she had managed to shake his control. And that was dangerous. Because if there was one thing she had learned about him, it was that he never let anything slip through his fingers without taking something in return. His lips quirked in a slow, calculated smirk. "Careful," he murmured, voice dark and smooth. "You're playing in my territory now."
She didn't step back.
Didn't break eye contact. Then maybe you should mark your territory properly. His fingers tightened slightly against her lower back, as if debating whether to accept the challenge. Then just as quickly he let go. The loss of his touch was like stepping away from a fire, sudden, jarring, leaving behind a lingering heat she refused to acknowledge. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm, unreadable. Not yet. It wasn't rejection. It was a promise. A warning. Her pulse should have slowed now that he had put distance between them, but instead, it only quickened. He was toying with her, letting her think she had the upper hand, only to pull her deeper into his game.
Fine.
Two could play that. She turned without another word and walked away, her dress sweeping behind her as she moved through the grand ballroom. But she didn't go far. She knew better than to let him think she was running. Instead, she found her next move. The CEO from earlier was standing near the dance floor, a glass of whiskey in his hand and an amused smirk already on his lips. "Change your mind about that dance?" he asked smoothly. She glanced over her shoulder, just enough to confirm what she already knew. He was watching. Good. She turned back to the CEO with a soft smile. "I think I just might have." She extended her hand, and he took it without hesitation, leading her onto the dance floor. The music shifted, slow and sultry, as hands found waists and shoulders, bodies pressing close. It was calculated. Every movement, every glance. She knew exactly what she was doing. And so did he. Because even as the CEO spun her gracefully, she could feel him, the weight of his stare, the tension simmering just beneath his composed expression. She had seen him negotiate billion-dollar deals without blinking, had seen him manipulate and control every situation with terrifying precision. But right now, she had his full attention. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. She let herself smile, not for the man holding her, but for the one watching. And then, strong fingers wrapped around her wrist. Not the CEO's.
Him.
Before she could react, she was being pulled away, his grip firm but careful, as if daring her to make a scene. He didn't stop until they were away from the dance floor, out of earshot of the curious onlookers. Then he let go. What the hell was that? His voice was low, calm, but laced with something dangerous. She raised a brow. A dance. His jaw tightened. With him? You didn't seem interested in dancing with me. A muscle in his jaw twitched. You're enjoying this, aren't you? She tilted her head, her lips curving slightly. Maybe. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the first real crack in his usual restraint. And for some reason, that made her chest tighten. You really think you can win this? He asked, stepping closer, his presence overwhelming. She lifted her chin. I think I already am. His fingers brushed against her wrist, barely there, a ghost of a touch that sent a shiver down her spine. We'll see, he murmured. But remember, when I take control, I don't play fair. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to smirk. Good. She leaned in, just enough for her lips to brush against the corner of his jaw. Neither do I. And with that, she stepped back, leaving him standing there, watching her walk away, again. This time, though, she knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was planning his next move. And the real game had only just begun. The moment she stepped away, she expected him to let her go, expected him to stand there, watching, calculating his next move like he always did. But this time he didn't. This time he followed. She barely made it past the balcony doors before she felt his presence behind her, a shadow moving in sync with hers. The night air was cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the heat curling low in her stomach. She placed her hands on the stone railing, looking out at the city skyline, pretending she wasn't aware of the man standing inches behind her. "You're playing a dangerous game," he murmured. She let out a soft breath, her voice steady. "And you're the one who told me to play." Silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, he moved closer until his chest almost brushed her back. His hands settled on the railing on either side of hers, caging her in without touching. "I did," he admitted, his voice a husky whisper against her ear. "But I never said you'd win." She swallowed hard, refusing to let her body react to the warmth of his breath on her skin. "Maybe I don't need to win. Maybe I just need to make you lose." His low chuckle sent a shiver down her spine. "And what exactly do you think I'm losing?" She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. His eyes were darker than before, sharp and filled with something she couldn't quite name. "Control," she said softly. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate response. The air between them thickened, heavy with something neither of them wanted to name. And then he moved. Not away. Closer. His fingers brushed against hers, slow and intentional, his touch featherlight, but enough to make her pulse stutter. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. She should. She should step away. She should remind him this was all just an act, a game, a battle of wills that neither of them could afford to lose. But she didn't. She didn't move.
Didn't speak.
Didn't do anything but close her eyes as his hand traced the inside of her wrist, his touch sending sparks through her veins. "You can't," he whispered, his lips hovering just over her ear. "Because you don't want me to." Her eyes snapped open, and just like that, she remembered why she was here, why she started this, what he had said. "She's just a game to me." The heat that had wrapped around her like a slow-burning fire turned cold, sharp. She forced herself to smile, forced herself to tilt her head just slightly, letting her lips graze his cheek before whispering, "Maybe I just want to see how far you're willing to fall." His breath hitched, but he recovered quickly, his smirk returning like armor. "Careful," he warned, fingers ghosting over her waist. "You might fall with me." She held his gaze unwavering. "Then let's see who hits the ground first." And with that, she turned, walking back inside without another glance. Her heart was pounding, her mind spinning. Because this was no longer just revenge. No longer just a game. Something was changing between them. Something she wasn't sure she could stop. And the most dangerous part? She wasn't sure she wanted to. She walked away without looking back, but she could feel him watching her. Always watching. The air inside the ballroom was suffocating compared to the cool night breeze, yet she didn't stop. She needed distance.
Space to breathe.
Because this wasn't just a game anymore. Somewhere between pretending and playing with fire, she had lost control. And maybe, just maybe, so had he. She barely made it to the exit before his hand caught her wrist. Not rough. Not forceful. Just firm. Unyielding. Running away? His voice was quieter now, no longer laced with amusement, but something raw, something real. She turned, her pulse skittering. "I already told you, I don't run." He studied her for a long moment, his grip not loosening. "Then tell me the truth." She stilled. "The truth?" "Yes." His thumb brushed over her wrist, a touch so light it sent a shiver down her spine. "Did you ever mean any of it? The touches, the glances, that moment on the balcony? Was all of it just revenge?" Her throat tightened. Yes. That was the answer she was supposed to give. That was the answer she needed to give. Because if she didn't, then everything she had planned, everything she had built, would come crumbling down. But when she opened her mouth, the lie wouldn't come. His eyes searched hers, waiting. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she finally admitted it. I don't know. The confession hung between them, raw and exposed. His grip tightened for a fraction of a second before he exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath. Neither do I. And just like that, the last of their game shattered. No more pretending. No more keeping score. Just them. Just this. His hand slid from her wrist to her fingers, intertwining them. I don't want to play anymore, he murmured, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Her heart pounded. Then what do you want? He stepped closer, closing the space between them. You. One word. Just one. But it unraveled everything. He lifted a hand to cup her face, his touch careful, waiting for her to pull away. But she didn't. And then, slowly, achingly, he kissed her. It wasn't rough. It wasn't about control. It was desperate. A confession without words. A surrender. And she kissed him back. Because maybe she had lost the game. Maybe she had fallen first. But for the first time, she didn't care. Because when he pulled her closer, when he whispered her name like she was something precious, something real, she knew one thing for certain. This had never been a game. Not really. And neither of them had ever stood a chance.